My name is Diana B. Kelly, and I am 41 years old. If you ask my parents, I ruined their 40th wedding anniversary. If you ask me, I finally stopped pretending. The whole thing took place at an exclusive country club just outside the city, the kind of place with white tablecloths so crisp they look starched, into submission and a string quartet that plays softly enough to remind you how expensive silence can be. It was all my mother's taste, which meant polished, formal, and emotionally distant. My father simply went along with it, smiling when expected, lifting his glass when cued, never questioning the script. My sister arrived like royalty. Her husband walked in carrying the kids, and the room seemed to reorient itself around them. My mother rushed over, hugging them so tightly it bordered on performance. Someone pressed champagne into their hands before they even found their seats. Compliments flew freely. My father laughed louder than usual, proud and animated in a way I'd learned not to expect for myself. It was the same dynamic I'd watched since childhood, just dressed up in nicer clothes. I arrived with my son. Brian is 15, quiet in the way kids get when they're observant, sharp enough to read a room without needing explanations. No one rushed us. No one reached for him. My father barely glanced up from the shrimp platter. I didn't take it personally in the moment. I never do. That's how it's always been. Danielle was the golden child, the one who checked all the boxes my parents cared about. Straight A's, picture-perfect marriage, 2 kids in private school. I wasn't a failure, but after my husband died 8 years ago, I became something else in their eyes, a complication they didn't know how to fix. Dinner itself passed without incident. Polite conversation, small laughs, the kind of evening where tension sits just beneath the surface but doesn't quite break through. Brian did his best to blend in with his cousins, and I kept my head down, focused on my plate. I told myself I was there for closure, for appearances, maybe even for hope, though I wouldn't have admitted that out loud. Then the cake was cleared, and my father stood up. He cleared his throat, that familiar sound that always meant a speech was coming. He started slow, talking about love and commitment and how rare it was to find a partnership that lasted 4 decades. People nodded along, glasses were lifted. It all sounded nice until he turned to my sister. He said Danielle had been their greatest blessing. He talked about watching her grow into the woman she is today as the joy of their lives. Then he looked at her children and called them perfect, said they were the legacy he and my mother had always dreamed of. My mother raised her glass beside him and added a toast to Danielle and her beautiful family, calling them the best part of their lives. I didn't feel anger. I felt something colder, like recognition finally settling in. Brian didn't look at them. He looked at me. He leaned close and whispered, "But what about me?" That was it. That was the moment everything crystallized. I stood up and gently tapped my glass, the sound cutting through the murmurs. Heads turned. My mother gave me a tight smile, the kind she uses when she expects something sweet and safe. I didn't give her that. I said I wanted to raise a glass to the worst parents in the room. A few people laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't. I said they'd finally said out loud what everyone already knew, that Danielle was their favorite and the rest of us were just scenery. I reminded them that while they were sending checks and babysitting on weekends, I was raising my son alone. After my husband died, they didn't even ask how we were surviving. I told them that at least now I knew it hadn't been an accident. It had been a choice. The silence that followed felt unreal. My father froze with his champagne still in his hand. My mother looked like someone had struck her. Relatives stared at me, as if I'd committed some unspeakable crime. Then the defenses came. People told me that wasn't something you said to your parents, that they'd done their best, that I should be grateful for the love they showed in their own way. Everyone rushed to protect them, everyone except Danielle. She didn't defend them. She didn't speak. She just stared at me like she'd seen something she couldn't unsee. My mother told me to leave. So I did. I told Brian to get his coat, and we walked out without another word. On the drive home, he didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He already knew the answer. The next morning felt heavier than the night before, not because I regretted what I'd said, but because I knew exactly what was coming. When families like mine are confronted with truth, they don't reflect. They reorganize the narrative. They decide who embarrassed whom, who overreacted, who needs to apologize so everything can go back to normal. I woke up on the couch with a stiff neck and a cold cup of tea on the coffee table. Brian was still asleep, wrapped in a blanket like he'd chosen comfort over explanations. I watched him for a moment longer than necessary, trying to memorize the quiet because I knew it wouldn't last. No one called to check if we made it home safely. Not my parents, not an aunt, not a cousin. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was deliberate. By mid-morning, my phone started buzzing, not with concern, but with commentary. A text from an aunt saying I'd made a scene. A voicemail from an uncle reminding me that parents aren't perfect and forgiveness is important. A message forwarded from someone else's account saying my mother was devastated. Not a single one asked what Brian had felt hearing his grandfather erase him from the family legacy. That told me everything. I spent the morning doing ordinary things on purpose. I made breakfast. I folded laundry. I took the trash out. Grief and clarity have a way of sharpening the mundane. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, my sister stood there in the same coat she'd worn the night before, hair pulled back like she hadn't slept. She didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped inside and looked around as if she were checking on damage, then sat at the kitchen table with both hands braced on the surface, breathing out slowly. She didn't defend them. She didn't ask me to apologize. She said, "They were awful last night. I'm not going to try to excuse it." She told me she'd seen Brian's face and mine and felt something break. When they returned to the hotel, our parents had acted as if nothing had happened, laughing about how dramatic I'd been, congratulating themselves on surviving the evening. She said she'd snapped, told them they were delusional if they thought they'd been good parents, told them she was tired of being the golden child if it meant the rest of us were treated like props. I didn't cry. I felt a tightening in my chest, the kind that comes when something you never expected finally happens. She asked if we were okay. Really? I told her the truth. We always manage. She nodded, then asked if she could talk to Brian later, alone, just to make sure he didn't carry this as proof that he didn't matter. I told her yes. After she left, the house felt different, quieter but steadier, like something unstable had finally been named. That evening, my parents called. I let it ring twice before answering. I didn't say hello. My mother didn't either. She went straight to accusation, asking how I could humiliate them in front of everyone. How dare I speak to them like that after everything they'd done for me? I didn't argue. I asked a single question. What did she believe they'd actually done for me? She answered immediately, as if she'd rehearsed it. They let me live in their basement, rent-free, for almost 3 months after my husband died. 3 months, that was the legacy she offered. She didn't mention the refusal to co-sign when I needed housing. She didn't mention telling me I was too emotional when I cried. She didn't mention the years they skipped birthdays, school events, weekends. She hung up before I could respond. That was when I understood this wasn't about one toast or one night. This was about decades of selective memory. The next few days brought more messages, more attempts to frame me as unstable, ungrateful, dramatic. My father left a voicemail saying I'd dragged Brian into adult problems, that I was punishing my sister for having a better life. Then, without irony, he said Danielle had always had to carry more because he couldn't handle his own life. He said it like it was common knowledge, like it explained everything. That sentence closed a door in my mind. I called my sister that night and told her I was done. Done hoping, done reaching, done pretending we were one conversation away from being a healthy family. I told her something I'd never said out loud before. Over the past decade, I'd helped our parents far more than anyone knew. Utilities paid quietly, groceries bought anonymously, a winter when I slipped gas money into Dad's coat pocket so their heat wouldn't be shut off. I never told Brian because I didn't want him to learn that love was transactional. I told her I wasn't doing it anymore. She didn't argue. She said, maybe it's time they see what it feels like to stand on their own. The next morning, my mother sent a long email, defensive, circular, full of phrases like misunderstanding and family values. She repeated the basement line as if those 3 months erased everything else. At the bottom, she wrote, "You're our daughter, whether you like it or not." I didn't reply. I wasn't angry. I was clear. Brian had been watching me through all of this, quietly taking notes. Midweek, Danielle came by again. This time she brought a folder. She set it on the table and slid it toward me. Inside was a copy of our parents' will. The house, the savings, the car, the insurance. Everything went to her. I was mentioned once, with a small, unspecified gift. Brian wasn't mentioned at all. Danielle said she'd confronted them and was disgusted by the explanation. I wasn't stable. I wouldn't know what to do with responsibility. She told me she'd moved out of the hotel and was staying elsewhere. Then she handed me a folded note they'd asked her to deliver as a peace offering. I didn't open it. I tore it in half and dropped it in the trash. Danielle nodded and said, "Good." She told me she was revising her own will to split things equally, even if they tried to change it behind her back. She refused to be used as a weapon. That night, my father called again, cautious this time. He said they didn't know how to help me after my husband died, that I'd changed, that it felt like I didn't want them involved. I told him grief doesn't come with instructions, and ignoring your daughter and grandson for years isn't a reasonable response to uncertainty. I told him I didn't want the relationship we had anymore, not one built on tolerance instead of love. He said they thought they were doing their best. I asked if he really believed that. The next morning, there was a pending deposit in my account from them. I declined it without blinking. When Brian told me his grandfather had left him a voicemail, asking if we'd have to take care of them someday, I sat him down and told him the truth. Family doesn't get a free pass to hurt you. Love is a gift, not a wage. He nodded, understanding more than I wished he had to. Nearly a month passed before anything shifted again. Then a handwritten letter arrived from my father. No excuses, no demands. He admitted they'd mistaken my silence for strength and failed to show up when I was surviving. He invited us to dinner on neutral ground, promising to listen without asking for anything. I didn't answer right away. Brian asked if they meant it. I told him I didn't know, but if we went, it would be for us. We met at Danielle's place. Simple food, no speeches. My parents looked older, smaller. During dinner, my father finally said it. They weren't good parents to me. He told Brian he deserved grandparents, not strangers. My mother added that if it didn't feel like love, then it wasn't. I didn't say I forgave them. I nodded and let the truth sit. After dessert, Danielle told me I was the strongest person she knew and hated that I had to be. I didn't cry. I felt something settle. For the first time, they listened. Not because they were owed forgiveness, but because I'd finally stopped explaining myself. The quiet that followed that dinner wasn't awkward, and it wasn't warm either. It was cautious. Like everyone in the room had finally understood the rules had changed, and no one was quite sure how to move without setting something off. We said goodnight without hugging. Brian thanked Danielle for the dessert. My parents stood near the door like guests who didn't know if they were welcome to linger. On the drive home, Brian stared out the window for a long time before he spoke. He said he didn't feel angry anymore, just tired, like he'd been holding his breath for years without realizing it. I told him that made sense, that sometimes relief feels like exhaustion before it feels like peace. The following weeks tested whether that dinner had been a turning point or just another pause before the cycle resumed. My parents didn't call every day. They didn't show up unannounced. They didn't send money or ask for it. That alone felt unfamiliar. When they did reach out, it was brief and contained. Questions about Brian's school, comments about the weather, updates about mundane things. I answered when I wanted to and didn't when I didn't. For the first time, the balance of effort felt even. I wasn't carrying the conversation. I wasn't filling silence out of obligation. Then something shifted again, not loudly, but decisively. Danielle called me one afternoon with a tone I hadn't heard before, not upset, not defensive, but resolved. She said she'd gone back to our parents' house to collect a few things she'd left behind and ended up staying longer than she planned. According to her, our parents were struggling in ways they hadn't admitted out loud. Not just emotionally, but practically. Bills stacked on the counter, notices they didn't fully understand. My mother trying to keep everything looking normal while the structure underneath quietly weakened. Danielle told me they'd never learned how to function without someone else smoothing the edges. First it was me, then it was her. Now it was no one. She said our father asked her if I was really serious about stepping back, about not helping anymore. Danielle told him yes, that I wasn't punishing them, I was protecting myself, and that if they wanted any relationship with me or Brian, it would have to exist without strings attached. Apparently he didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "I don't know how we got here." That was the first time he'd said anything resembling reflection instead of defense. Around the same time, extended family members, who had once flooded my phone with opinions, went quiet. Not because they'd suddenly understood, but because the narrative had lost its energy. Drama thrives on reaction. When there is none, it starves. I noticed it in small ways. An aunt who used to comment passive-aggressively on every photo stopped engaging altogether. A cousin who'd tried to guilt me into apologizing unfriended me quietly. I didn't feel rejected. I felt lighter. Brian changed too. He started talking more, not about the anniversary or his grandparents, but about school, about plans, about the future. One night, while we were doing dishes together, he said he liked that our house felt calm now, that it didn't feel like something bad was always about to happen. I realized then that what I'd done hadn't just been for me. It had changed the emotional climate he was growing up in. That mattered more than any apology. The real test came unexpectedly. My mother called one evening, her voice steadier than it had been in months. She asked if she could come by alone, just her, no agenda. I told her she could. She arrived without gifts, without that nervous smile she used to wear when she wanted something. She sat at the table and folded her hands like she was waiting to be told where she stood. She said she'd been thinking a lot about what I'd said at the anniversary, about how long it had been since she'd really asked how I was doing. She admitted she'd assumed I was strong because I never asked for help, that she hadn't considered that maybe I didn't ask because I'd learned it wouldn't be offered. It wasn't a perfect conversation. She still framed some things in terms of intention instead of impact. But she listened. When I told her how alone I'd felt after my husband died, how invisible Brian had become in their world, she didn't interrupt. She cried quietly, not theatrically, not to be comforted, but because something had finally landed. Before she left, she asked if she could start over slowly, if she could earn time with Brian instead of assuming it. I told her that was the only way forward. She nodded, accepting it without argument. That was new. After she left, I sat alone for a long time thinking about how strange it was that boundaries, the thing I'd been taught were selfish, had actually created the first real chance at honesty we'd ever had. Nothing was fixed, nothing was guaranteed, but for the first time I wasn't negotiating my worth. The next few months were quieter on the surface, but underneath, everything was recalibrating. I learned that healing doesn't arrive like a sunrise. It creeps in sideways, through small moments where the old patterns don't immediately reassert themselves. My parents didn't call when they were anxious. They didn't hint at needs or slide guilt into conversation like a blade hidden in velvet. When problems came up, they handled them, or didn't, and either way, they didn't look to me as the solution. That alone told me the boundary was holding. Danielle and I started talking more, not about our parents at first, but about ourselves. She admitted something I'd never expected to hear. Being the favorite had never felt like winning. It felt like pressure, like she was constantly performing a role she didn't audition for. She said she'd learned early that love came with conditions, that praise could turn into punishment if she ever stepped out of line. I realized then that we hadn't grown up in two different families. We'd grown up in the same one, just assigned different jobs. Mine was to absorb neglect quietly. Hers was to succeed loudly. Neither of us had been allowed to simply be. There were setbacks. Old instincts don't disappear overnight. One afternoon, my father called. With a voice that sounded too familiar, that careful blend of fatigue and expectation. He mentioned a bill he didn't understand and asked if I could just take a look. I felt the reflexive pull immediately, the urge to fix it before the discomfort spread. I paused, breathed, and told him I couldn't help with that, but he could call the company directly. There was a silence on the line that stretched longer than usual. Then he said okay and hung up. No anger, no lecture, just acceptance. When I put the phone down, my hands were shaking, but not from fear, from relief. Brian noticed these moments before I did. He'd glance at me after a call and ask, "Was that okay?" And I'd tell him yes, because it was. Each time I chose not to rescue someone at my own expense, I felt a little stronger, a little more grounded in the kind of example I wanted to set for him. I wasn't teaching him how to cut people off. I was teaching him how to stay present without disappearing inside other people's demands. The extended family made one last attempt to pull me back into the old role. It came in the form of a group message about the holidays, framed as reconciliation, but loaded with expectation. Plans were suggested that assumed I'd host, organize, pay. I responded with a short message wishing everyone well and explaining that we'd be spending the holidays quietly at home. No explanations, no apologies. The thread went silent. For the first time, the absence of reaction didn't feel like rejection. It felt like peace being defended. The real test arrived when my parents invited us to Brian's school play. Not as guests of honor, not as a performance for others, just an invitation, simple and unadorned. I asked Brian what he wanted. He thought about it and said he'd like them to come, but only if they could sit where everyone else sat. No special treatment, no backstage access. When I relayed that condition, my mother said okay without hesitation. At the play, they arrived on time, found their seats, and clapped when everyone else did. Afterward, my father told Brian he'd done a great job and asked him about his favorite scene. It was ordinary in the best way. When they left, they didn't linger. They didn't claim a victory. They didn't ask for more. They simply went home. That night, I understood something important. Accountability isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic apologies. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like doing less instead of more, like accepting a smaller role because you finally realize you haven't earned a bigger one. I didn't know where this would lead long term. I wasn't naive enough to believe years of damage could be undone in a season, but I also wasn't willing to live in permanent war. The boundary I'd drawn wasn't a wall. It was a filter. It let through what was safe and kept out what wasn't. And for the first time, I trusted myself to maintain it. Time did what confrontation never could. It stripped everything down to what was real and left no room for performance. Months passed, and the absence of constant tension became the new normal. My parents didn't suddenly transform into people they had never been, but they did something quieter and harder. They adjusted. They stopped assuming access. They stopped treating my silence as defiance and started treating it as information. The biggest shift wasn't in them, it was in me. I noticed it one morning while packing Brian's lunch, humming without realizing it. There was no knot in my stomach, no rehearsed conversations playing in my head, no anticipation of a call that might derail the day. I wasn't bracing anymore. For most of my life, I had lived as if I were always about to be evaluated, corrected, or found lacking. That background noise was gone, and without it, I could hear myself think. Brian flourished in the calm. He laughed more easily. He stopped asking questions that carried quiet fear underneath, questions like whether people were mad at us or whether he'd done something wrong. One evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, he told me he felt proud of how I handled things with his grandparents. I asked him what he meant. He said, "You didn't yell, but you didn't let them be mean either. You just stopped it." That might be the best description of boundaries I've ever heard. Danielle and I grew closer than we'd ever been. Without our parents controlling the narrative, we were free to see each other clearly. She admitted she was still untangling her own guilt, still learning how to separate responsibility from obligation. I told her she didn't owe me anything. Neither of us owed our parents a version of ourselves that hurt to maintain. We were just sisters now, not roles. There were no more dramatic apologies from my parents, no declarations of changed hearts. But there were small, consistent choices. They asked before visiting. They respected no when it was given. They stopped comparing. When Brian spoke, they listened. When I disagreed, they didn't punish me with silence or sarcasm. It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the past. But it was honest in a way we'd never had before. One afternoon, my father told me something I'd never heard him say in my life. He said he wished he'd been braver as a parent, that it had been easier to focus on what looked successful than to sit with what was painful. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't expect reassurance. He just said it and let it exist. That mattered. I never forgot the anniversary. I never forgot the toast or the look on Brian's face when he asked where he fit. But I stopped reliving it. It became part of the story, not the whole thing. A turning point, not a wound that defined us. I don't know what the future holds with my parents. I don't need to. What I do know is this. My son will grow up understanding that love doesn't compete, that presence matters more than praise, and that you never have to shrink yourself to earn a place at the table. He will see a mother who chose clarity over comfort and peace over approval. And that feels like breaking a cycle in the only way that really counts. I didn't ruin an anniversary. I ended a pattern. And for the first time, that ending feels like a beginning.